Go ahead and leave. My rich wife dared me. You won't survive a week without me. I just left my keys on the counter of the house I paid for. Her boss and father called her nonstop next day, screaming, "The bank just called US. What did you make him do?" Look, I'm not going to pretend this was some cinematic moment where the rain was pouring and violins were sobbing in the background. It was a Tuesday. The dishwasher was running its second cycle because Bianca never scraped the plates properly, and somewhere in the living room, her phone was pinging with notifications like a slot machine that never pays out. That's when she delivered her Oscar-worthy line, the one she'd probably been workshopping in her head for weeks. Go ahead and leave. You won't survive a week without me. She said it with this smile, this wine-soaked, perfectly practiced smile that had won her countless arguments, manipulated her way through family dinners, and convinced her Instagram followers that she was living some kind of aspirational dream life. Her breath smelled like the $15 Chardonnay she pretended was 30, and she stood there with her arms crossed, waiting for me to crumble like I was supposed to, like some pathetic sitcom husband who couldn't figure out how to work the washing machine without her divine intervention. Here's the thing about people who threaten you with your own supposed inadequacy. They genuinely believe it. Bianca had spent the better part of 3 years casually mentioning how I'd be lost without her, how she was the glue holding our life together, how I was basically a functional man-child who'd probably starve or wear mismatched socks if she wasn't around to supervise my existence. She'd joke about it at parties, turning my supposed helplessness into cocktail hour entertainment. "He doesn't even know where we keep the nice towels," she'd laugh, and everyone would chuckle because it's funny when a wife gently roasts her husband, right? It's adorable. It's relatable content. Except she actually believed every word, and that belief had calcified into this unshakable certainty that I was nothing without her. So when I reached into my pocket, pulled out my keys, and set them on the kitchen counter with the kind of deliberate calm you'd use when placing a chess piece, I could see the confusion flicker across her face. Front door key. Truck key. The little brass one for the safe in the bedroom closet where she kept her grandmother's jewelry, and I kept documents she never bothered to read. I lined them up like soldiers, each one a small goodbye, each one a period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing in my head for months. No suitcase. No dramatic speech. No throwing clothes into garbage bags while screaming about betrayal and wasted years. You can't get applause for a quiet exit because nobody's watching closely enough to notice the performance, and honestly, that's exactly how I wanted it. Walking out of that house felt weirdly clean, like finally scratching an itch that had been bothering me for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like not to be irritated. She expected the whole production. The yelling match where we'd rehash every petty argument from the past 5 years, the tears and the begging and the maybe we can work it out conversation that would inevitably end with me sleeping on the couch and pretending things could get better. She wanted the show, the drama, the content she could later spin into a sympathetic narrative where I was the villain and she was the wronged woman picking up the pieces. I gave her none of that. I gave her a full refund in silence, returned her investment in this relationship without so much as a receipt or an explanation. She'd always joked that I was boring, and you know what? She wasn't wrong. I am boring. Gloriously, magnificently boring. I'm the guy who reads the terms and conditions. I'm the guy who color codes his file folders and actually knows where the tax returns from 2019 are stored. I'm the guy who would rather spend a Friday night organizing the garage than hitting some overpriced bar where everyone's shouting over music that's too loud and drinking cocktails that cost more than a decent steak. Bianca used to roll her eyes at my spreadsheets, at my habit of reading consumer reports before making any purchase over $50, at the way I'd spend Sunday mornings quietly sipping coffee and reviewing our budget while she scrolled through influencer accounts and added things to her online shopping cart that we definitely didn't need. But that night, Boring looked different. Boring looked like a man who'd finally run out of patience and started running on plans instead of feelings. Boring looked like someone who'd spent months quietly, methodically preparing for this exact moment, while everyone around him assumed he was too checked out or too comfortable or too whatever to actually do anything about his situation. There's this weird assumption in our culture that if you're not constantly expressing your emotions, you're not feeling them. Like quiet people are just NPCs wandering through life without any internal narrative. But let me tell you something about boring people. We notice everything. We file it away. We wait. I walked to my truck, which I'd conveniently parked on the street instead of in the driveway. Another tiny detail that probably seemed meaningless at the time, but was actually part of the plan. The night air was cool and perfect, the kind of temperature where you don't need a jacket, but you're glad you have one anyway. I could hear Bianca inside, probably staring at those keys on the counter, probably waiting for me to come back, because surely I wouldn't actually leave. Surely this was just some dramatic gesture meant to scare her into being nicer, or paying more attention, or whatever it was I supposedly wanted. I imagined her picking up her phone, maybe texting her best friend Sarah about how I was having a moment, and would be back before midnight, tail between my legs, ready to apologize for whatever imaginary crime she'd decided I'd committed. I didn't look back. Not because I'm cold or heartless or trying to prove some kind of point, but because looking back would have meant I was still engaged, still participating in the drama, still playing my assigned role in her narrative. And I was done with that role. I was done being the boring husband, the reliable backstop, the guy who made everything work behind the scenes while she took credit for our life looking good from the outside. I fired up the truck, which started on the first try because I'm boring enough to actually maintain my vehicle, and I pulled away from that house with its perfect landscaping and its mortgage that was about to become very interesting. The funny thing about quiet exits is that they're almost invisible, like a magic trick performed with paperwork instead of cards. Nobody sees it coming because nobody's watching. They're too busy expecting fireworks to notice the fuse being carefully, methodically cut. Bianca wanted theater, wanted a scene she could later recount with dramatic pauses and strategic tears. What she got was a man setting down 3 keys and walking away like he was leaving a restaurant after a mediocre meal, not worth complaining about, but definitely not worth returning to. And you know what? That felt absolutely perfect. Bianca thought my spreadsheets were some kind of weird fetish, and honestly, she had every right to laugh. While she was busy perfecting her influencer pose in our bathroom mirror, testing different angles to make our granite countertops look more expensive than they actually were, and scrolling through Zillow listings for condos in Costa Rica that she'd never actually buy but liked to fantasize about, I was in the home office doing what she called that boring accountant stuff. Except I'm not an accountant. I'm a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company, which is somehow even more boring than being an accountant. But it taught me something valuable: how to plan 17 steps ahead while everyone else is still arguing about step 2. See, I like paper. I really like it. Contracts, clauses, signatures, addendums, riders. All those sexy things that absolutely nobody talks about at dinner parties because they'd rather discuss their Peloton stats or their kids' travel soccer drama. There's something deeply satisfying about a well-structured legal document, the way everything interlocks like a puzzle designed by someone who actually wanted you to solve it. Bianca would walk past my office, see me highlighting sections of our mortgage paperwork or cross-referencing trust documents, and she'd make this little snorting sound, like I was some kind of domesticated weirdo who got excited about things that should have put me to sleep. "You and your papers," she'd say, shaking her head with this mixture of pity and amusement, like she'd married a guy whose idea of a wild Friday night was reorganizing the filing cabinet. But here's what she didn't understand, what she couldn't have understood even if I tried to explain it. Those papers weren't just papers. They were architecture. They were blueprints. And for months, while she was building her personal brand and planning hypothetical tropical vacations, and casually mentioning to her friends that maybe marriage wasn't the forever thing people pretended it was, I'd been quietly building something too. I'd been turning our shared life into the most beautiful, boring, legally ironclad Rube Goldberg machine you've ever seen. Trusts, LLCs, shell companies with names so bland they could cure insomnia. My personal favorite was Morningstar Vessel, which sounds like either a new age yoga studio or a boat rental company, but was actually an excellent vehicle for moving assets around in ways that were completely legal and absolutely devastating if you happened to be on the wrong side of them. The whole thing started about 8 months ago, right after that dinner party at her father's house, where Bianca got a little too comfortable with the wine and a little too honest with her opinions. We were sitting at this massive dining table, the kind that seats 12 but only ever has 6 people around it, because who actually has that many friends? And Victor Moreau, her father, was holding court like he always did, talking about market opportunities and portfolio diversification and all the stuff that rich people discuss to remind everyone else they're rich. Bianca's boss Graham was there too, this slick private equity guy who wore expensive watches and cheaper ethics. And at some point the conversation turned to me, specifically to what I brought to the table, and Bianca, emboldened by her third glass of whatever pretentious vintage her father had selected, basically implied I was decorative. Not in those words, obviously. She was too smart for that. But she did this thing where she'd talk about us, and somehow only her accomplishments would get mentioned. Our investment strategy, which was really her father's investment strategy that I'd quietly improved. Our real estate moves, which were really my research and due diligence that she'd taken credit for. Our financial stability, which she somehow attributed to her career in marketing at a company that was about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. And then Graham, because he's the kind of guy who thinks he's charming when he's actually just rude, made some joke about how I was the foundation while Bianca was the penthouse. And everyone laughed except me, because I was too busy doing the mental math on exactly how screwed they'd all be if the foundation decided to relocate. That's when I started really planning. Not out of spite, exactly, though I'd be lying if I said spite wasn't part of the fuel mixture. But more out of this crystal clear realization that I was in a relationship with someone who genuinely believed I was replaceable, upgradable, like I was some kind of base model appliance she could swap out for a nicer version once her stock options vested. And you know what? If that's how she saw me, then I had absolutely zero guilt about treating our shared finances like the complex infrastructure project they actually were. The meetings with lawyers and bankers were honestly kind of hilarious. I'd show up in my regular work clothes, nothing fancy, carrying a folder with color-coded tabs, because of course I had color-coded tabs, and these professionals would look at me like I was either a criminal mastermind or the most organized divorced dad they'd ever met. There was this one banker, older guy named Richard who'd probably seen every financial maneuver in the book, and when I laid out what I wanted to do, he actually smiled. Not a big smile, just this tiny little twitch at the corner of his mouth, and he said, "Son, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen someone weaponize a limited liability corporation quite this elegantly." I took that as a compliment. The mechanics were pretty simple, actually, which is what made it beautiful. Everything Bianca thought was ours was structured in ways that made perfect sense when we were a functional couple, but became absolutely catastrophic the moment I removed myself from the equation. Joint guarantees that suddenly weren't so joint anymore. Insurance riders that only worked if both names remained on the policy. Lines of credit that depended on my income verification and excellent credit score, which, spoiler alert, I wasn't planning to keep sharing. Every single document had these little clauses, these tiny legal footnotes that nobody ever reads because they're boring and technical, and who has time for that? And every single one of them was now a small bomb with my hand on the detonator. Bianca never asked what I was doing. Not once. I'd come home from a meeting with our estate attorney, and she'd be on the couch with her laptop, editing photos of herself holding a coffee cup in front of a sunset, and she'd say something like, "How was your day, babe?" in that voice people use when they're asking but not really asking, and I'd say, "Fine, just some paperwork stuff." And that would be the end of it. She trusted that I was handling the boring stuff so she didn't have to, which was exactly what I'd been counting on. She'd even sign things sometimes, documents I'd bring home with little sticky arrows pointing to where her signature went, and she'd barely skim them. "What's this one?" she'd ask, pen already in hand. "Just updating the trust documentation," I'd say, which was technically true, and she'd sign it while scrolling through Instagram with her other hand. There was this one evening, maybe 2 months before I left, where we had a moment that would have been poignant if it wasn't so perfectly ironic. She made dinner, which was rare because cooking wasn't really her thing, and she'd opened a nice bottle of wine, and she came into my office with 2 glasses and said, "Let's celebrate adulting." She meant the fact that we had our shit together, that we owned property and had investment accounts, and looked like functioning adults from the outside. We clinked glasses, and she called me her responsible, boring husband, with this affectionate tone, like it was a pet name, and the whole time I was thinking about the LLC formation documents I'd filed that morning. Morningstar Vessel was officially real, officially mine, and officially ready to catch everything that was about to fall when I pulled the supports out from under our shared financial life. The thing about being boring is that nobody sees you coming. They're too busy looking at the interesting people. Trigger day was a Wednesday, because of course it was. Wednesdays are peak boring. the absolute middle of nothing. The day when most people are just trying to survive until the weekend without falling asleep in a conference room or spending too much money on lunch. I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 towns over, the kind of generic place with exposed brick and Edison bulbs where everyone's pretending to write a screenplay but actually just refreshing their social media feeds. I had my laptop, a mediocre Americano that costs $6 for some reason, and a very specific checklist that I'd been refining for weeks. This wasn't a moment for drama or second-guessing. This was a software update, except instead of fixing bugs, I was introducing a whole bunch of very intentional features into Bianca's life. The first action item was beautifully simple: revoke my guarantor status on a package of loans tied to the house. Now, to a regular person who doesn't spend their free time reading financial documents like they're mystery novels, that probably sounds like some kind of bad science fiction plot, like I'm describing a spaceship's navigation system instead of boring banking stuff. But here's what it actually meant. Our house, that beautiful 3-bedroom with the renovated kitchen and the backyard that Bianca loved to photograph for her home and lifestyle content, was financed through a structure that required both of us to guarantee the debt. It was one of those things her father had set up because Victor Morrow loved complicated financial instruments the way some people love craft beer, always talking about the subtle notes and sophisticated structures that made them superior to the basic options. The loans weren't even primarily in our names. They were business loans, tied to one of Victor's smaller LLCs, used to purchase the property as an investment that we just happened to live in. Tax advantages, he'd explained over cigars one time, waving his hand like he was conducting an orchestra of money. The whole setup was perfectly legal and actually pretty clever, the kind of thing that saves rich people thousands in taxes while the rest of us pay full freight on everything. But it had one tiny, beautiful vulnerability. My signature as co-guarantor wasn't permanent. It could be revoked with proper notice to the lending institution, and that notice period, buried in Section 7.3 of an addendum I'd actually read, was exactly 14 days. 14 days that had expired yesterday at 5 p.m., right on schedule. One mouse click. That's all it took. I logged into the bank's online portal, navigated to the guarantor management section that probably 0.1% of customers even know exists, and I clicked the button that said Revoke Guarantee. The system asked me if I was sure, because systems always ask if you're sure, like they're trying to give you one last chance to reconsider your choices. I was sure. Then came the 2-factor authentication code, sent to my phone in a text message that felt weirdly casual for something this significant. 6 digits. I typed them in with the same level of emotional investment I'd used to verify a password reset for my Netflix account. And just like that, a whole scaffolding fell away. To the bank's automated systems, this was just routine administrative maintenance. To Bianca's father's financial structure, this was an earthquake measuring somewhere around 7.0 on the Richter scale. Because here's the thing about guarantees, they're insurance policies. They're the bank's safety net that says, if this borrower can't pay, we've got this other person who promised they would. Remove one guarantor from a 2-guarantor loan, and suddenly the bank's risk assessment changes dramatically. Suddenly they start asking uncomfortable questions like, hey, can the remaining guarantor actually cover this if things go sideways? And in this case, with Victor's LLC showing some creative accounting that looked great on paper, but not so great under actual scrutiny, the answer was going to be somewhere between probably not and definitely not. I remembered that dinner party, the one where Bianca had basically announced to her father and her boss Graham that I was optional equipment in her life, like heated seats in a car, nice to have, but not necessary for the vehicle to function. She'd been so confident, so casual about it, sipping her wine and laughing at Graham's jokes while I sat there being decorative and boring. She loved being dramatic, loved making these sweeping statements about what she would or wouldn't tolerate, about how she was destined for bigger things than suburban married life. I loved being quiet and efficient, loved the fact that while she was performing for an audience of people who didn't actually care about her, I was mentally reviewing legal documents and calculating exactly how many dominoes I could knock over with one carefully placed finger. My phone buzzed about 4 hours later. Not Bianca's number, which I'd been half expecting, but Victor's. The man himself, calling me directly, which almost never happened because why would he call me when he could just relay messages through his daughter? I let it go to voicemail because I was in the middle of lunch, and also because the pettiness of making him wait felt deeply satisfying. When I finally listened to the message, I had to replay it 3 times because it was that good. His voice had this quality I'd never heard before, something between panic and rage, like he'd just discovered his favorite restaurant had closed or his golf club had revoked his membership. "What the hell did you do?" That was the opening line. No hello. No, hey. It's Victor. Just straight into accusatory confusion. "The bank just called us. They're saying there's a problem with the guarantor structure on the Elmwood property. They're saying you withdrew your guarantee. They're talking about calling the loan. What did you make Bianca do? Call me back immediately." The message ended with that particular kind of silence that happens when someone's so angry they forget to say goodbye before hanging up, just a little empty space followed by the beep. What did I make Bianca do? That line deserved a standing ovation, maybe some of those little applause emojis that people spam in group chats. It deserved to be framed and hung on a wall somewhere, maybe with a little museum placard underneath explaining the historical context. Because in Victor's world, in the universe where he and his daughter existed, there was no possible scenario where boring, reliable, decorative me had independently decided to do anything. Obviously, Bianca must have forced my hand somehow, must have done something so catastrophic that I'd reacted in this dramatic fashion. The idea that I might have been planning this for months, that I might have been several chess moves ahead while they were all still arguing about whether we were playing chess or checkers, that didn't even compute. I didn't call him back. Not immediately, anyway. I finished my lunch, which was a pretty decent turkey sandwich from a deli that actually understood the correct bread-to-meat ratio, and I thought about how funny it was that all of these complications and consequences, had started with something as simple as revoking a guarantee. I hadn't stolen anything, hadn't committed fraud, hadn't done anything illegal or even particularly aggressive. I'd simply removed my name from a document, exercised my legal right to stop guaranteeing someone else's debt, and the entire structure had started cracking because it was never as solid as everyone pretended it was. Bianca called next, about 20 minutes after her father's voicemail. Her tone was different than his, less angry and more confused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle, but someone had given her pieces from the wrong box. "Babe, my dad's freaking out about something with the house loans. He says you did something? Can you call him and fix it? I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." I could hear music in the background, that generic pop stuff she always played when she was getting ready to go out, and I realized she genuinely had no idea what was happening. She thought this was a clerical error, a simple miscommunication that boring, reliable me would clear up with a phone call and an apology. I texted her back instead of calling, because texts are wonderfully impersonal and you can edit them before sending. Make sure every word is exactly what you want it to be. Not a misunderstanding. Talk to your lawyer. Send. 3 seconds of typing, years of consequences. I imagined her reading it, probably reading it twice because it didn't make sense the first time, and then slowly realizing that maybe I wasn't quite as boring and predictable as she'd always assumed. The ripples were spreading out now, circles on a pond, getting bigger and bigger. One click had become phone calls, voicemails, confused texts. Soon it would become meetings, emergency consultations, panic conversations with bankers and attorneys. And I'd be nowhere near any of it, just a guy who'd removed his signature from a document and walked away clean. Boring people don't make waves, everyone knows that. But sometimes boring people know exactly where to drop the stone. The beautiful thing about modern finance is how much of it happens in these boring little administrative portals that look like they were designed in 2003 and never updated. You log in with a username that's probably too similar to your other usernames. You navigate through menus that make zero intuitive sense, and you click buttons that have catastrophic real-world consequences but look exactly like the button you'd click to update your mailing address. It's democracy in action, really. Anyone can destroy someone's financial life if they have the right login credentials and enough patience to deal with terrible user interface design. Next on my checklist was the insurance rider, specifically the business-type policy that covered the property and was tied to Victor's LLC structure. This was one of those things that Bianca had signed off on years ago, back when we were still in the phase of our relationship, where she thought it was cute that I handled all the boring money stuff, so she could focus on her career and her content creation and her vision boarding or whatever it was she did with her free time. The policy had both our names on it as interested parties, which in insurance speak means we both had skin in the game, both had the right to make changes, and both were necessary for the coverage to remain in its current generous state. I canceled my portion of the rider on a Thursday morning, right after my second cup of coffee and right before a conference call about shipping logistics that I barely paid attention to. The insurance company's website was actually pretty decent, which was surprising. Clean interface, clear options, a little chatbot in the corner asking if I needed help. I did not need help. I needed to remove myself from a policy, which took about 4 clicks and 1 electronic signature. The system asked me to confirm that I understood the implications of my action, that removing myself as a named party would alter the coverage structure. I clicked, yes, I understand, with the same level of concern I'd have clicking through a software license agreement, which is to say none whatsoever. What happened next was automatic and beautiful. The insurance company's algorithm, which is way smarter than most people give it credit for, immediately recalculated the risk profile. 1 guarantor instead of 2. 1 income stream, verifying the ability to pay instead of 2. The premium went up, obviously, because that's what premiums do when risk increases. But more importantly, the default protection flipped entirely to Bianca's name. She was now the primary contact, the primary payer, the primary person responsible for making sure this thing didn't lapse. Responsibility had been transferred like a hot potato, except instead of a potato, it was a monthly bill she'd never seen before because I'd always handled it, and instead of being hot, it was ice cold and about to give her freezer burn. Meanwhile, the ferry of funds into Morningstar vessel was proceeding exactly on schedule. I'd set this up weeks ago, these quiet little transfers that looked completely legitimate because they were completely legitimate. Money from joint accounts getting redistributed according to the lovely paperwork that Bianca had signed without reading. Assets moving from places where they were shared to places where they were very much not shared. The LLC I'd created was hungry and efficient, swallowing up everything I'd carefully positioned for it to swallow. And the beautiful part was that every single transaction had a paper trail that showed proper authorization and legal transfer of ownership. I imagined Bianca trying to deal with the insurance situation, and the mental image made me smile into my coffee. She'd get the notification email, probably skim it while she was doing something else, maybe posting a story about her morning smoothie or responding to comments on her latest photo. The email would have a subject line like, "Important changes to your policy," and she'd probably ignore it at first, because who actually reads insurance emails? They're designed to be ignored, written in this language that makes your eyes glaze over, full of terms like modification of coverage parameters and updated premium structure that might as well be ancient Greek for all the sense they make to normal people. But then the phone calls would start. Customer service representatives with their scripted politeness, explaining that there had been changes to the account, that action was required, that if payment wasn't received by a certain date, there would be consequences. I could picture her calling the insurance company, being put on hold, listening to that generic waiting music that all companies use, the kind that sounds like an elevator going sideways. Your estimated wait time is 45 minutes. Your call is very important to us. Nothing says, your call is important, quite like making someone listen to smooth jazz for 3/4 of an hour. And when she finally got through to an actual human, when she tried to explain that there must be some mistake, that her husband had always handled this, that surely they could just reverse whatever change had been made, they'd tell her what they had to tell her. The modification was legally authorized, properly documented, and irreversible without the consent of the party who'd initiated it, which would be me, who was not currently taking her calls. The default protections flipping to her name was maybe my favorite detail of this whole operation. In the original structure, if something went wrong, if payments were missed or coverage lapsed, the liability was distributed between multiple parties. It was diffused, shared, manageable. Now it was concentrated, singular, hers. Every missed payment, every lapsed coverage period, every little administrative failure would have her name on it, her credit score attached to it, her reputation on the line. She'd always wanted to be the main character in her own story, always positioned herself as the star of our shared narrative. Well, congratulations, you're the lead now. Hope you memorized your lines. People who think forms are tiny reptiles tend to get bitten eventually. That's not really a saying, but it should be. Because there's this whole category of people who treat paperwork like it's beneath them, Like reading the fine print is for suckers and paranoid people who don't trust anyone. They sign things because signing things is what you do to make the boring parts of life go away faster. They don't realize that every signature is a promise, every checkbox is a commitment, every initial next to a paragraph is you saying, "Yes, I read this, I understand this, I agree to be bound by this." And when those promises come due, when those commitments turn into consequences, suddenly the boring paperwork becomes very interesting indeed. Bianca's phone must have looked like a Christmas tree on fire, all those notifications lighting up the screen at once like some kind of digital emergency. I wasn't there to see it, obviously, because I was staying at my sister's place temporarily while I figured out my next permanent move, but I could picture it perfectly. Her phone sitting on the nightstand, buzzing and pinging and generally losing its mind while she was probably still half asleep, trying to figure out if the noise was part of a dream or actual reality. Welcome to reality, babe. It's less filtered than your Instagram feed and significantly less forgiving. Victor Moreau, her father, had apparently spent the previous evening on the phone with various financial institutions, and based on the voicemail evidence I was collecting like baseball cards, he'd gone through several distinct emotional phases. First was confusion, that surely there's been some mistake. Energy where he was still assuming this was a clerical error that could be fixed with the right conversation and maybe a sternly worded email. Then came anger, the how dare someone disrupt my carefully constructed financial arrangements phase where he was looking for someone to blame and settling on me as the obvious villain. And finally, somewhere around 3 in the morning based on the timestamp, he'd arrived at panic, which is where wealthy people end up when they realize their money might actually be at risk. His voicemails to Bianca were works of art, really. I know this because she forwarded them to me in a moment of desperation, probably hoping I'd hear her father's distress and feel guilty enough to fix everything. What she didn't realize is that listening to Victor Moreau panic was like watching a movie I'd written, directed, and produced. I knew every beat, every plot twist, every moment where he'd realized something new and terrible. The first voicemail was relatively calm. "Just to call me when you get this. We need to discuss something about the Elmwood property." Professional. Controlled. The voice of a man who still believed he was in charge of the situation. By voicemail number 4, things had deteriorated significantly. "Bianca, what the hell did you do to make him leave? The bank is talking about accelerating the loan. Do you understand what that means? That means they want all the money now. They're saying your husband withdrew his guarantor status, and now the whole structure is compromised. They're questioning the LLC's ability to service the debt. Call me immediately." The progression from confusion to blame was fascinating. In Victor's mind, this had to be Bianca's fault somehow, because the alternative was that boring, reliable, decorative me had outsmarted him, and that simply wasn't possible in the universe where he was the financial genius and I was the lucky guy who'd married into competence. Bianca called me at 7:15 in the morning, which showed a stunning lack of awareness about what happens when you let someone walk out of your life. I was having breakfast with my sister Mara, enjoying some actually decent scrambled eggs, and trying to explain to her 6-year-old nephew why cereal is not a suitable breakfast food for every single meal, when my phone started vibrating across the table. I glanced at the screen, saw Bianca's name, and went back to my eggs. Mara raised an eyebrow. "Not answering?" she asked, and I shook my head. "Nothing she has to say is more important than these eggs," I said, which was true and also probably the most profound thing I'd said all week. She called again, and again. By the 4th call, my nephew thought it was hilarious, this game where my phone kept buzzing and I kept ignoring it like it was a telemarketer trying to sell me an extended car warranty. "Daddy says you should always answer the phone," he informed me seriously, and I had to explain that sometimes adults make strategic decisions about communication, which is a complicated way of telling a 6-year-old that ignoring people is occasionally the right move. He seemed satisfied with this explanation and went back to his cereal, which he'd successfully argued should count as breakfast. Then came the texts, a whole parade of them, each one progressively more desperate. "Please call me." Then, "We need to talk about the house." Then, "My dad is freaking out and I don't understand what's happening." Then, my personal favorite, "This isn't funny anymore." That last one made me actually laugh out loud, because it implied there was a phase where this was funny, some joke we were sharing, some prank that had gone on too long and now needed to be wrapped up, so we could all go back to normal. There was no normal to go back to. Normal had left the building along with my keys. Victor tried calling me directly around 8:30, probably after Bianca admitted she couldn't reach me. I put him on speaker, which in retrospect was probably petty but also deeply entertaining. Mara was loading the dishwasher, and when she heard Victor's voice coming through my phone, she actually stopped what she was doing to listen. It was that kind of performance. Listen, I don't know what Bianca did or said to upset you, but we need to resolve this situation immediately. The bank is threatening to call the loan on the Elmwood property, which affects not just you and Bianca, but several of my business operations. This is bigger than whatever marital issue you're having. The assumption that this was about a marital spat, that I was throwing some kind of financial tantrum because my feelings were hurt, was almost adorable in its total misunderstanding of the situation. Victor genuinely believed that money and business were his domain, that I was just a supporting character who'd briefly stepped out of line and needed to be guided back to my proper role. He couldn't conceive of a world where I'd been planning this, where every legal document he'd had me sign had been carefully analyzed for exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities, where his own complicated financial structures were about to collapse specifically because they were so complicated. Victor, I said, using his first name because we were past the point of me calling him Mr. Moreau like a respectful son-in-law. I'm not sure what you want me to tell you. I exercised my legal right to remove myself as a guarantor on loans I no longer wish to guarantee. Everything I did was properly documented and completely legal. If that creates problems for your business operations, maybe your business operations shouldn't have been dependent on your son-in-law's signature. Mara made a little ooh sound from across the kitchen, the way people do when someone says something particularly devastating in an argument. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Victor recalculating, trying to figure out if threatening me would work or if he needed to switch to a different strategy. He went with indignation mixed with condescension, which was honestly not his best choice. You have no idea what you're doing. You're going to hurt Bianca with this little stunt. Is that what you want? To punish your wife because you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Midlife crisis. That was rich. Like the only reason a man would carefully dismantle his financial entanglements was because he was emotionally unstable and needed to buy a sports car or take up rock climbing or whatever it is people think happens during midlife crises. I'm 34, I pointed out. That's a little early for midlife unless I'm planning to die at 68, which seems pessimistic. And I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply declining to continue guaranteeing debt for people who've made it very clear they don't value my involvement in their lives. Seems pretty rational to me. He tried a few more approaches, ranging from attempted guilt-tripping to veiled threats about lawyers, but none of it landed because none of it was relevant. He was used to operating in a world where money was leverage, where the person with the most resources could pressure everyone else into compliance. What he hadn't counted on was that I didn't want anything from him. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't asking for a better deal or trying to gain advantage in a divorce settlement. I was just leaving, cleanly and completely, and taking my legal obligations with me. When I finally ended the call, Mara was grinning. I've never heard you talk to him like that, she said, and I shrugged. I've never had a reason to. He was always Bianca's dad, always the guy I had to be polite to at family dinners. Now he's just a guy with a collapsing loan structure who's mad that I'm not fixing it for him. She handed me a fresh cup of coffee and clinked her mug against mine. To not fixing other people's problems, she said, and I drank to that. Bianca's company, Bayfield Capital Marketing Solutions, was one of those outfits that sounds way more impressive than it actually is, like how sanitation engineer sounds better than garbage collector, but you're still taking out the trash either way. They specialized in marketing for mid-tier financial services companies, which basically meant making boring investment products seem exciting enough that people might actually buy them. Bianca was good at it, I'll give her that. She knew how to make a PowerPoint sing, how to turn dry financial data into a narrative that felt aspirational. She'd built a decent reputation there, got promotions at a reasonable pace, and her boss Graham absolutely loved her because she made him look good at the quarterly presentations to their private equity overlords. But here's the thing about working at a company that's backed by private equity. They audit everything. And I mean everything. They're not doing it to be mean or invasive. They're doing it because they've invested money and they want to make sure that money isn't being set on fire or used to fund someone's gambling habit or whatever other creative ways people find to destroy capital. So when the ripples from my little financial restructuring started spreading outward, when banks started making phone calls and asking uncomfortable questions about loan guarantees and asset verification, those ripples eventually hit Bayfield Capital's monthly risk assessment review. The company had extended a bridge loan to Victor's LLC about 18 months ago. It was one of those cozy arrangements that happen when personal relationships intersect with business, the kind of deal that makes sense at a cocktail party but looks weird under actual scrutiny. Graham had pushed it through, probably as a favor to Bianca, or maybe because Victor had promised some future business relationship or whatever currency powerful men trade when they're being friendly with each other. The loan was secured against several properties, including the Elmwood house, and was guaranteed by Victor's personal assets along with, you guessed it, co-guarantors who provided additional security to make the numbers work. When my name disappeared from those guarantees, when the insurance structure shifted and the whole careful Jenga tower started wobbling, Bayfield's automated risk monitoring system did what it was designed to do. It flagged the loan as potentially compromised. Someone in the risk management department, probably a person whose entire job is staring at spreadsheets and looking for red flags, noticed that a key guarantor had withdrawn from multiple related obligations. They escalated it to their supervisor. That supervisor escalated it to the CFO. And the CFO, who actually read the full report instead of just skimming it, realized that one of their marketing directors was married to the guarantor who'd just pulled out. And that same marketing director's father was the primary borrower on a loan that was now looking significantly less secure than it had at the last quarterly review. The dominoes were falling in slow motion, and I wasn't even in the room to watch it happen. I only knew about it because my friend Derek, who works in an adjacent industry and hears all the gossip through his network of professional connections, sent me a text that said, "Yo, is your wife's company doing some kind of internal investigation? Heard some weird things through the grapevine." I texted back that I had no idea because that was technically true. I didn't know the specifics. I just carefully engineered the circumstances that would inevitably lead to exactly this kind of situation. Bianca's first indication that her work situation was deteriorating came during a routine staff meeting, the kind that usually involves someone presenting updated social media metrics while everyone else tries not to fall asleep. Graham, who normally treated these meetings like his personal TED Talk opportunity, was weirdly quiet. He kept looking at his phone, which is generally a power move that says, "I have important things happening that are more significant than this meeting." But his face had this pinched quality that suggested the important things were not going well. Bianca texted me about it, because apparently we were still at the phase where she thought she could text me about her day, and I'd respond like everything was normal. "Graham is acting weird," she wrote. "Think something's going on with the PE investors." I didn't respond, obviously, because I was busy doing literally anything else, but I saved the text because there was something darkly funny about her not connecting the dots. In her mind, these were separate problems. Her weird husband who'd left and was refusing to engage, her father's banking issues that she didn't fully understand, and now her boss acting strange during meetings. They were isolated incidents, unrelated complications in her otherwise manageable life. The idea that they were all connected, that they were all consequences of the same carefully executed plan, hadn't occurred to her yet. The payroll wobble happened 3 days later. Not a full-on disaster, not a "sorry folks, we can't pay you this month" situation, but a delay. An email went out from HR saying there was a minor processing issue with the direct deposits and everyone would be paid by end of business instead of first thing in the morning like usual. Now, to regular employees, this probably seemed like a technical glitch, the kind of thing that happens when someone forgets to click the right button or a bank transfer gets held up for some boring reason. But to anyone who understands how payroll actually works, especially at a company that's supposed to be financially sophisticated, a payroll delay is a massive red flag. It means cash flow problems. It means someone higher up is juggling accounts and buying time. Bianca had been trading on what I called the stable husband brand for years, probably without even realizing she was doing it. In professional environments, especially in financial services, people notice things like marital stability, homeownership, the appearance of having your life together. It's not fair and it's definitely not supposed to matter, but it does. When you're married with a nice house and a spouse who has a solid job and good credit, people subconsciously categorize you as lower risk. You're a safe bet. You're the kind of person who pays their bills on time and doesn't make impulsive decisions. Bianca had benefited from this halo effect, this assumption that because her personal life looked stable from the outside, she was therefore stable and reliable in professional contexts. But brands expire, especially when the label gets pulled off and everyone can see what's actually inside the bottle. Word travels fast in professional circles, particularly when money is involved. People talk at industry conferences, they gossip at networking events, they share information over drinks after work. And the information currently circulating was that Bianca Moreau's husband had walked out, her father's loans were in trouble, and there were questions about some bridge financing that Bayfield had extended to a related party. Individually, none of these things would have been catastrophic. Together, they created a narrative that was deeply unflattering and professionally toxic. The office whispers started like they always do, quietly and deniably. Someone would be talking near the coffee machine, and the conversation would pause just slightly when Bianca walked by. People who used to stop by her desk for casual chat suddenly had very urgent things they needed to do elsewhere. Graham, who'd always been generous with public praise and high-profile project assignments, started being weirdly formal with her. Lots of, "let's put that in writing," and "can you send me an email documenting that decision," which is corporate speak for, "I'm building a paper trail in case I need to throw you under a bus later." My personal favorite moment in this whole corporate unraveling, which again, I only heard about secondhand, was when Bianca tried to call into a leadership team meeting from home. She'd apparently decided that working remote that day was a good idea, maybe because the office vibe was getting uncomfortable, or maybe because she was dealing with some personal crisis related to her imploding housing situation. Either way, she dialed into the video conference wearing what someone described to me as definitely a bathrobe, with her hair in a messy bun and this expression on her face that suggested she'd been crying recently and was trying very hard to pretend she hadn't been. Graham had apparently asked her a direct question about the status of a client presentation, and her answer had been vague and scattered, not her usual polished professional delivery. Someone on the call, and this is the detail that made me actually laugh when I heard it. Someone had actually said, "Bianca, are you okay? You seem distracted," which in corporate language is basically calling someone out for being a disaster. She tried to rally, had said something about having a lot going on personally but nothing that affects my work, which is exactly what you say when your personal life is absolutely affecting your work and everyone knows it. Her voicemail box was probably a horror show at this point. Victor calling with updates about the loan situation, Graham calling with carefully worded questions about her current circumstances, maybe the bank calling about insurance payments or property documentation, and somewhere in that mix, probably a few calls from friends who'd heard through the grapevine that her marriage had imploded and wanted the gossip disguised as concern. I didn't listen to my own voicemail anymore. I'd set up a system where everything just went to a transcript that I could skim when I felt like it. But I imagined hers was full of increasingly urgent messages from increasingly panicked people. The tragedy and comedy of it all was that Bianca still thought this was fixable, that if she could just talk to me, just explain whatever she thought needed explaining, everything would go back to normal. She hadn't grasped yet that normal was gone, that the life she'd been living was like a stage set that looked solid from the audience, but was actually just painted plywood held up with careful engineering. And I'd removed the supports. Not dramatically, not with explosives or sabotage, just by quietly withdrawing my participation in the construction. Turned out the whole thing couldn't stand on its own. Bianca stormed into the bank on a Friday afternoon, which is objectively the worst time to storm into a bank because everyone else is also there trying to handle their financial business before the weekend. I wasn't present for this encounter, obviously, but I heard about it from Alan Mercer, the senior banking officer who'd been handling our accounts for the past 4 years and who had the kind of professional discretion that made him perfect for this situation. Alan called me later that day, not to gossip exactly, but to give me a heads up that Bianca was making inquiries and that he'd handled it according to the documentation we'd filed weeks earlier. His tone suggested he'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. According to Alan, Bianca arrived wearing sunglasses indoors, which is never a good sign. It either means you're trying to hide the fact that you've been crying, or you're trying to look important and intimidating, or both. She walked up to the counter with the kind of energy that says, I am about to make this everyone else's problem, and asked to speak with someone about her accounts immediately. The teller, bless her heart, probably took one look at this situation and decided she was not paid enough to deal with whatever was about to happen, so she called Alan out from his office. Alan Mercer is the kind of banker who makes you understand why people used to trust banks. He's somewhere in his late 50s, has reading glasses that he wears on a little chain around his neck like someone's grandfather, and speaks in this calm, measured tone that suggests nothing you're upset about is actually worth being upset about. He's seen market crashes, real estate bubbles, divorces, bankruptcies, and every other flavor of financial disaster that humans can create. An angry woman demanding answers about her accounts barely registered on his scale of interesting problems. He invited Bianca into his office, which is decorated with pictures of his grandkids, and has a little bowl of butterscotch candies on the desk that nobody ever takes, but somehow makes the whole space feel more trustworthy. Alan pulled up the account records on his computer, reviewed the notes from our previous meetings, and then delivered the news with the emotional investment of someone reading a weather report. Mrs. Moreau, your husband closed his accounts with us approximately 2 weeks ago. The joint accounts were divided according to the authorization you both signed last year. Your individual accounts remain active, but the property liens and associated financial instruments have been modified per the documentation filed with the court. Bianca apparently did not take this well. She went through the standard stages of denial, which Alan had definitely witnessed before. First was, there must be some mistake, delivered with that confident tone people use when they're absolutely certain they're right and the world is wrong. Alan, because he's a professional, pulled up the actual documents on his screen and swiveled the monitor so she could see the signatures. Her signature. Multiple signatures, actually, on multiple documents, each one clearly dated and notarized. Then came the "I never signed that" phase, which is where people go when they realize they did sign something but have no memory of actually reading it. This is the natural consequence of treating paperwork like an obstacle to overcome rather than a contract to understand. Alan, still maintaining his grandfather at Thanksgiving dinner level of calm, explained that all signatures had been authenticated, all documents had been reviewed by legal counsel, and everything had been processed according to standard banking procedures and state law. The third stage was bargaining. The "can't we just reverse this" energy that suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how legal documents work. Bianca apparently asked if they could simply undo the changes, put everything back the way it was, because surely there was some process for fixing mistakes. Alan explained, in his infinitely patient way, that these weren't mistakes. These were intentional actions taken by an authorized account holder, properly documented and executed. Reversing them would require the consent and cooperation of that account holder, which would be me, who was not currently interested in cooperating. By the time Alan got to explaining that the property was under review and that the bank had flagged several concerns about the existing mortgage structure, Bianca had apparently moved into a kind of stunned silence. This is the phase where people realize that the problem is bigger than they thought, that it's not a simple misunderstanding that can be cleared up with a phone call, that the foundation of their financial life has shifted and they're only just now feeling the earthquake. Alan told me that she sat in his office for a long moment, just staring at the papers he'd printed out for her, documents that explained in clear legal language exactly what had happened and why. He offered her the butterscotch candies, which she declined, and then she asked the question that people always ask when their world is falling apart. Why would he do this? Alan, because he's been doing this job for decades and knows that why is not really a banking question, simply said, "I'm afraid that's something you'd need to discuss with your husband, Mrs. Moreau." From a banking perspective, all actions taken were legal and properly authorized. She left the bank with a manila folder full of documents, which she probably still hasn't fully read, and according to Alan, she looked like someone who'd just been told that gravity was actually optional, and she'd been obeying it unnecessarily her whole life. The whole encounter had taken maybe 20 minutes, which is about how long it takes to explain to someone that their financial reality is not what they thought it was. When Alan called me later, he didn't ask about the personal details because that's not his style. He simply confirmed that he'd provided Bianca with the documentation she'd requested and that all account activities had been conducted according to procedure. Then he said something that I thought was pretty profound for a banker. "You know, in 30 years of doing this, I've learned that people who don't read what they sign eventually meet people who do. It's not personal, it's just math. I thanked him for handling everything professionally, and we ended the call. If bank notices were poetry, mine would be a haiku of ruin. Short lines, sharp edges, no wasted words. Meanwhile, while Bianca's world was imploding in slow motion like a building demolition filmed for a documentary, I was eating steak with actual human beings who knew how to be human. My sister Mara, her husband Tobin, and my old buddy Jorge were sitting around Mara's dining table, which was covered in one of those tablecloths that's supposed to be fancy, but is really just from Target, and we were finishing off some legitimately excellent ribeyes that Tobin had grilled to absolute perfection. This wasn't a celebration exactly, more like the kind of meal you have when something significant has happened and nobody needs to make a big dramatic production out of it. Jorge was telling a story about a ceiling fan he'd installed backward at a client's house, which sounds impossible, but is apparently something that can happen if you're distracted and don't double-check the wiring diagram. So the damn thing is spinning the wrong direction, and the lady standing there saying her room feels hotter than before, and I'm looking at it thinking something is fundamentally wrong with physics, he said, waving his fork for emphasis. We all laughed because it was genuinely funny and also because it was nice to laugh about something that wasn't emotionally complicated. Mara refilled everyone's wine glasses, though I'd switched to water because I was driving later, and she raised her glass in a small toast. To new air, she said simply, and we all clinked glasses. It wasn't triumph, wasn't vindictive celebration, just acknowledgement that sometimes life requires you to change your atmosphere. Tobin added, and to people who actually read contracts, which got another laugh because they all knew exactly what I'd been doing for the past few months. My phone lit up on the table next to my plate, buzzing with notifications. Bianca's name flashed across the screen, then Victor's, then a number I didn't recognize that was probably Graham or someone from Bayfield. I glanced at it the way you'd glance at a browser tab you forgot to close, mildly aware of its existence, but completely uninterested in engaging with it. Jorge noticed and grinned. "You gonna get that?" he asked, and I shook my head. "Nah, probably just spam," I said, which was technically true if you considered people who treated you like you were disposable to be spam. This chapter was gentle in a way the others hadn't been. There was no scheming, no legal maneuvering, no dramatic reveals. Just good food, old friends, and the kind of comfortable silence that happens when people have known each other long enough that conversation doesn't need to fill every moment. Tobin asked if I needed help moving any furniture from storage. Jorge offered to let me crash at his place if Mara's guest room got old, and Mara just squeezed my shoulder as she cleared plates, which was her way of saying everything she needed to say without actually saying it. We ended the evening on the back porch, watching the sun go down and absolutely not discussing the multiple voicemails accumulating on my phone. Jorge lit a cigar, which Mara pretended to disapprove of but secretly didn't mind, and someone made a joke about how boring people throw the best quiet exits. I smiled into my water glass, thinking about how I'd spent years being the reliable one, the stable one, the boring husband who kept everything running smoothly. Turned out boring people don't implode when things fall apart. We just file things, close accounts, and walk away clean while everyone else is still trying to figure out what happened. Bianca got a package at work on a Tuesday morning, delivered by regular courier service with no return address, and her name spelled correctly on the label, which should have been her first clue that this wasn't junk mail or a promotional sample of protein powder that nobody asked for. According to the office gossip network that I was still peripherally connected to through Derek's girlfriend, who worked in an adjacent suite, Bianca opened the padded envelope at her desk while sipping her usual overpriced latte, probably expecting it to be something mundane like a replacement credit card or documents from her lawyer. Instead, she found a USB drive. Just a plain black thumb drive, the kind you can buy in a 10-pack at any office supply store, with a small sticky note attached that said Play ME in printed letters. Not handwritten, because handwriting can be traced and analyzed, but printed in a standard font that could have come from any printer anywhere. Very dramatic, very mysterious, and knowing Bianca's curiosity and her complete lack of cybersecurity awareness, I knew she'd plug that thing into her work computer without a second thought about malware or viruses or any of the very real reasons you shouldn't insert random USB drives into company equipment. The video file was labeled dinner_March_15.mp4, which was specific enough to be intriguing, but vague enough that she probably spent a few seconds trying to remember what had happened on March 15th before she clicked play. What happened on March 15th was that dinner party at Victor's house, the one where she'd had too much wine and too much confidence and had essentially performed a one-woman show about how I was optional equipment in her life. The one where Graham had made his stupid joke about foundations and penthouses. The one where I'd sat there quietly, eating overpriced beef tenderloin and mentally cataloging every word for future reference. I hadn't been the one holding the camera, obviously. That would have been too obvious, too premeditated in a way that could be used against me later. But Victor's house has a security system with cameras in the common areas, including the dining room, because wealthy people are paranoid about their stuff getting stolen and also because they like to have footage for insurance purposes. The system saves everything to a cloud server, and the password for that server was written on a sticky note in Victor's home office, which I noticed one time when I was using his bathroom during a previous dinner party. People who write passwords on sticky notes deserve whatever happens to them, honestly. The video quality was decent, good enough to clearly show everyone's faces and, more importantly, clearly capture the audio. Bianca watched herself on screen, saw the wine glass in her hand, heard her own voice saying things she'd probably convinced herself she'd never actually said out loud. The jokes about how she was the real breadwinner. The casual mentions of how I was just along for the ride. The moment where she'd actually said, and this was the key line that I'd made sure was perfectly audible, "Honestly, if we split up, I'd be fine." Better than fine, probably. He'd be the one struggling to figure out basic life stuff. She watched herself laugh at that line, watched Graham laugh, watched her father smile indulgently like she was a precocious child saying something adorable. And then the video cut to black, but instead of ending, text appeared on the screen. White letters on a black background, formatted like a legal document because that's exactly what it was. Addendum 4C from our property trust agreement, the section that specifically outlined the conditions under which guarantor status could be revoked and assets could be redistributed. The section she'd signed without reading, initialing every page while probably checking her phone with her other hand. The text stayed on screen long enough to read twice, long enough to understand that every single action I'd taken had been authorized by documents she'd personally signed. And then the video ended with a final screen that just said, "Boring people read contracts." No signature, no identification, nothing that could be traced back to me directly, just a statement of fact that happened to be devastatingly accurate. According to Derek's girlfriend, who heard it from someone who'd been in the office at the time, Bianca sat at her desk for a full minute after the video ended, just staring at her computer screen with this expression that people described as somewhere between shocked and nauseous. Then she unplugged the USB drive, shoved it in her desk drawer, and spent the next 20 minutes in the bathroom. When she came back, her eyes were red and her makeup was smudged, and she tried to act like everything was fine, but everyone in the office could tell something significant had just happened. The HR memo came the next day. Not a termination, because firing someone whose marriage and family finances are publicly imploding would be legally risky, but a carefully worded email about managing personal circumstances that may impact professional performance, and suggesting that Bianca might want to consider taking some personal leave to address ongoing situations. Corporate speak for, "You're becoming a reputational risk, and we'd prefer you weren't visible right now." The memo was CC'd to Graham and the department head, which meant it was official and on record, which meant Bianca's professional reputation was now formally compromised. People she'd once charmed, colleagues who used to stop by her desk for advice or casual conversation, started treating her like she had some kind of contagious condition. Not meanly, exactly, but with that careful distance people maintain around someone whose life is visibly falling apart. They'd smile politely in the hallway, say generic things like, "Hang in there," without actually asking what was wrong, and find reasons to be busy when she tried to engage them in longer conversations. It's brutal, the way professional communities can collectively decide someone is no longer worth investing in. And it happens quietly enough that there's no single moment you can point to and say, "That's when everything changed." She'd always wanted to be the star of her own show, always positioned herself as the main character in every narrative. She'd curated her Instagram to show a life of enviable success, posted carefully filtered photos that suggested she had everything figured out, wrote captions about manifestation and self-care and living your best life. And now she was definitely starring in her own show, except it had turned into one of those reality TV disasters where the protagonist makes increasingly desperate decisions while everyone watches and judges, and thanks God they're not in that situation. The irony, and I say this without any joy because there's something sad about watching anyone's life collapse even when they kind of deserve it, is that she'd been right about one thing. She always wanted to be on camera, always wanted her story told. Turns out reality TV producers prefer drama, not accounting. But accountants and boring project managers who read the fine print, they prefer documentation. And documentation doesn't care about your personal brand or your Instagram following or how charming you are at dinner parties. It just exists, permanent and unforgiving, waiting patiently for someone to actually read it and understand what it means. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail, because that's how these things work when they're official and legally binding and absolutely not something you can ignore or pretend didn't happen. The envelope was thick, full of documents that explained in exhaustive legal detail exactly what was about to occur and why, and it was addressed to both Bianca Moreau and the various LLCs that technically owned the property. The mail carrier probably had no idea they were delivering a small bomb made of paper, just another day of work, another stack of letters and packages that represented the full spectrum of human experience from birthday cards to financial devastation. I wasn't there to see Bianca receive it, obviously, but I could picture the scene perfectly. She'd probably been having coffee, maybe checking her phone for the 100th time that morning, scrolling through social media, and seeing other people's carefully curated lives, and wondering how everything in her own life had gone so spectacularly wrong so quickly. The doorbell would have rung. She would have signed for the envelope without really looking at it because people on autopilot just sign for things, and then she would have opened it right there in the entryway, probably still holding her coffee mug, probably expecting it to be something boring and administrative that she could deal with later. The first page would have been the notice itself, formatted in that official legal style that makes everything sound both important and incomprehensible at the same time. Notice of default and intent to foreclose in big letters at the top, followed by paragraphs of whereas and therefore and pursuant to, all of it adding up to one simple message. The property was going into foreclosure because the loan obligations had not been met and the security structure had fundamentally changed. The house she'd been living in, the house she'd been photographing for Instagram, the house that represented stability and success, and all the things she thought she'd built, was about to be taken away. There would have been additional pages explaining the timeline, the various rights and options available, the process for contesting the foreclosure if there were grounds to do so, all of it written in language that requires either a law degree or significant patience to fully understand. But the core message was simple enough that even someone in panic mode could grasp it. You have 90 days to resolve this situation or the property will be sold at auction. 90 days to come up with the money, to restructure the loans, to somehow repair the elaborate financial architecture that had been supporting this whole arrangement. 90 days that she absolutely did not have the resources or knowledge or support system to successfully navigate. The wind caught the pages as she stood there reading, or trying to read, probably having to go back and reread sentences multiple times because when you're in shock your brain doesn't process information normally. The pages fluttered in her hands like they were trying to escape, which was metaphorically appropriate. Everything in her life was trying to escape at this point. Her marriage, her job security, her father's goodwill, her financial stability, all of it slipping away like water through fingers that couldn't close fast enough to hold onto anything. I imagine she called Victor first, because that's what people do when they're in crisis. They call their parents even when their parents are part of the problem. Victor, who at this point was dealing with his own cascading series of financial complications, and probably wasn't thrilled to get another panicked phone call from his daughter. The conversation probably went something like her crying and him yelling and both of them trying to figure out how this had happened, how they'd gone from comfortable and secure to foreclosure notices in what felt like no time at all, but was actually several months of very carefully planned and executed financial restructuring. Then she probably called her lawyer, if she had one, or tried to figure out if she needed one. or spent an hour on Google trying to understand what her options were. She probably texted her friends, the ones who were still responding to her messages anyway, with some vague reference to dealing with house stuff that didn't capture even a fraction of how serious the situation actually was. And at some point, probably after exhausting every other option, after being told by multiple professionals that her situation was complicated and serious and would require significant time and money to potentially resolve, she decided to call me. Not text, call, which showed a level of desperation that would have been touching if I'd been inclined to be touched by it. My phone rang while I was at my actual job, sitting in a meeting about shipping logistics and supply chain optimization, discussing things that were boring and practical and had absolutely nothing to do with my personal life. I saw her name on the screen, declined the call, and went back to the conversation about container shipping rates. She called again 5 minutes later, and again 10 minutes after that. By the fourth call, the people in the meeting were starting to notice, and I finally excused myself and stepped into the hallway. I didn't answer the call. I just stood there in the corporate hallway with its terrible fluorescent lighting and motivational posters about teamwork, watching my phone vibrate in my hand, watching her name appear and disappear as the call eventually went to voicemail. Then came the texts, a whole rapid-fire sequence of them, each one progressively more desperate. Please pick up. We need to talk about the house. I know you're angry, but this is serious. My lawyer says you're the only one who can fix this. Please, I'm begging you. That last one, the begging one, that was new territory. Bianca didn't beg. Bianca demanded, suggested, implied, manipulated, but she didn't beg because begging required admitting you weren't in control, and she'd spent her entire adult life maintaining the illusion that she was always in control. But foreclosure notices have a way of stripping away illusions and leaving people face to face with reality in its least flattering form. And the reality was that she'd built her life on a foundation that included me, had signed documents that tied her financial future to my cooperation, and had then proceeded to treat me like I was replaceable and boring and fundamentally unnecessary. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another one, deleted that too. Finally, I settled on something simple. Talk to your lawyer. I'm sure they'll explain your options. Hit send. Put my phone on silent. Went back to the meeting. It was probably the cruelest thing I could have done because it offered no hope, no possibility of negotiation, no suggestion that I was open to discussing anything. It was a door closing quietly but completely, the kind of ending that doesn't give you anything to argue against or push back on. She showed up at my truck 2 days later. I was leaving work, walking through the parking lot with my laptop bag and my coffee thermos, thinking about stopping for groceries on the way back to Mara's place, when I saw her standing next to my truck. She looked terrible, which I say not with satisfaction, but with the clinical observation of someone who used to care about this person and now felt mostly nothing. Her hair wasn't done with her usual precision, her makeup was minimal, and she was wearing yoga pants and a sweatshirt, which for Bianca was basically the equivalent of showing up in a hospital gown. This was her showing me she was vulnerable, that she'd abandoned all the performative aspects of her personality to just be raw and honest. "We need to talk," she said as I approached, and her voice had this quality that I'd never heard before, something between exhaustion and desperation. "Please, just 5 minutes. You owe me that much." The "you owe me" angle was interesting, like somehow I was in debt to her for the privilege of having been married to her, for having had the honor of guaranteeing her family's loans and supporting the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. I didn't know her anything, but I was curious what 5 minutes of conversation would sound like, what arguments she'd prepared, what cards she thought she still had to play. "I don't owe you anything," I said, unlocking my truck with the key fob. "But you can talk while I load my stuff." I opened the back door, put my laptop bag on the seat, took my time arranging things that didn't need to be arranged, giving her the space to make her case. She launched into this whole speech about how we could fix this, how if we just worked together we could restructure the loans, satisfy the bank, make everything go back to how it was before. She talked about marriage counseling, about communication problems, about how maybe they'd both made mistakes and could learn from them. It was a good speech, actually. She'd clearly practiced it, hit all the right emotional notes, acknowledged fault without taking too much responsibility, offered hope without making specific promises. If this were a movie, This would be the scene where the music swells and the protagonist realizes they still love each other and they embrace in the parking lot while the camera pulls back to show the sunset, or whatever. But this wasn't a movie, and I wasn't interested in the narrative she was trying to construct. Bianca, I said, finally turning to look at her directly. Do you remember what you said at your father's dinner party? About how you'd be fine if we split up, better than fine probably, and I'd be the one struggling. She opened her mouth to respond, probably to say she didn't remember or didn't mean it or was joking, but I kept talking. You were right. You should be fine. You're smart, capable, you have a career and connections, and all the things successful people are supposed to have. The problem is that your version of being fine was built on my signature on documents you never bothered to read. She tried to interrupt, to explain or defend or redirect, but I was done listening. I'd spent years listening, years being the supportive spouse who nodded and agreed and signed things, because that's what good husbands do. Years of being told I was boring and reliable and fundamentally unnecessary to her vision of her own success. And now that the boring, reliable foundation had removed itself, she was discovering that structures need support to stand up, that success built on paperwork requires someone to actually read and maintain that paperwork. I need you to stop contacting me, I said, and my voice was calm because anger would have given her something to work with, something to respond to or match or deflect. Calm was impenetrable. I need you to work with your lawyer and your father and figure out your situation without involving me. Everything I did was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was signed by both of us. You just never bothered to read what you were signing because you trusted that boring me was handling the boring stuff. Well, I handled it. And now you're dealing with the consequences of not paying attention. She started crying then. Real tears, not performative ones. And I felt something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't satisfaction either. Just this profound tiredness. This sense that we'd reached the end of something that had been ending for a long time, and we were finally acknowledging it. Please, she said again, and it was almost a whisper. Please don't do this. I know I messed up. I know I took you for granted. But we can fix this. We can fix us. There is no us, I said, opening my driver's side door. There's you dealing with your situation, and me moving forward with my life. Those are separate things now. She grabbed my arm, not aggressively but desperately, like I was a life preserver and she was drowning, which was actually pretty accurate. I can't lose everything, she said, and there was genuine terror in her voice. The house, my job, my dad is furious. Graham is talking about letting me go. I can't do this alone. You told me you'd be fine alone, I reminded her, gently removing her hand from my arm. You told everyone at that dinner that you were the penthouse, and I was just the foundation. Well, penthouses are great until the foundation leaves. Then they're just expensive rooms falling through empty air. It was maybe more poetic than the moment required, but it felt true. She'd built her self-image on being independent and superior and not needing me for anything except the boring logistics of life. And now the boring logistics were turning out to be the actual important stuff. I got into my truck, and she stood there in the parking lot, crying and trying to think of something else to say, some other argument that might work. I started the engine, which turned over smoothly because I maintained my vehicle like a boring, responsible person, and I rolled down the window one last time. Not to offer hope, not to soften the blow, just to say one more thing that needed saying. You should read contracts, Bianca. They're boring, but they're important. That's the whole point of boring things. They matter. Then I rolled the window up. Not dramatically, not slamming it shut like in a TV show, just pressing the button and watching the glass rise steadily between us like a curtain falling at the end of a performance. She could see me through the glass, and I could see her, but the conversation was over. The window was a physical barrier that said everything words couldn't say. We're done. There's no negotiation. There's no last-minute save. There's just you on that side and me on this side and a pane of glass that represents every boundary I should have established years ago. I pulled out of the parking space slowly, carefully, checking my mirrors like you're supposed to because even in emotionally charged moments, you should follow basic traffic safety. Bianca stood there watching me leave, probably expecting me to stop, to change my mind, to roll down the window one more time and tell her I was kidding or I'd had my revenge and now we could move forward. But I didn't stop. I just drove away at a reasonable speed, obeying the parking lot signs, and using my turn signal when I exited onto the main road. Because drama that's perfectly staged looks silly, and I'd never been interested in looking silly. The drive back to Mara's place took about 20 minutes, and I spent it not thinking about Bianca or the foreclosure or any of the complicated aftermath that would continue to unfold over the next several months. I thought about boring things, what I needed to pick up from the grocery store, whether I should start looking for my own apartment or keep staying with my sister, what project deadlines I had coming up at work. Normal, boring, everyday concerns that had nothing to do with collapsed marriages or financial warfare or any of the dramatic elements that had consumed the past few months. When I pulled into Mara's driveway, I sat in the truck for a moment before going inside, just letting the engine run and feeling the subtle vibration through the steering wheel. There's something satisfying about a well-maintained machine doing exactly what it's supposed to do. No drama, no complaints, just reliable function. That's what I'd been in the marriage, a well-maintained machine, keeping everything running while being taken for granted. And now I was still a well-maintained machine, but I was running on my own terms, going where I decided to go, serving purposes I chose. Boring men don't implode when their lives fall apart. We don't have public meltdowns or post cryptic social media messages or make dramatic gestures that look good in the moment but don't actually solve anything. We file things. We read contracts. We understand that the boring parts of life, the paperwork, the procedures, the careful documentation of everything, those are the parts that actually matter when everything else falls away. And when it's time to leave, we don't burn bridges or slam doors or create scenes that people will talk about for years. We just set down our keys, walk away clean, and let the natural consequences of other people's choices play out exactly as they were always going to. The truck hummed its sensible song, a reliable engine singing the kind of tune that nobody writes pop songs about, but everybody depends on. And somewhere behind me, Bianca was probably still standing in that parking lot. Or maybe she'd gotten in her car and driven home to the house with the foreclosure notice on the counter. Or maybe she was calling her lawyer or her father or one of her friends who was still taking her calls. Whatever she was doing, it didn't involve me anymore. And that, finally, was exactly how it should be. The credits were rolling on a story that had never really been a romance. More like a cautionary tale about the importance of reading what you sign and respecting the people who handle the boring stuff that makes your life work. And as credits go, mine were pretty simple. Boring man, careful planner, person who finally stopped participating in someone else's narrative and started living his own. Not exciting, maybe, but honest. And after years of living in someone else's version of reality, honest felt absolutely perfect.